And now on BBC Radio 4, Something Understood, Glimpses in the Garden. Joyce Lane is an artist and art therapist. For about 30 years she's been collecting art she describes as art extraordinary, which is sometimes known as outsider art. She shows the work in a tiny gallery in the Scottish fishing village of Pittenweem. And some of the art is produced by patients with mental illness, but some is by reclusive folk. All of it gives the rest of us a way of glimpsing unfamiliar places. After Joyce graduated from Art College, she got a job at a TB sanatorium.
These were the early days when art therapists were hardly known of. I came in about the late 1950s, which was really the end of tuberculosis in Scotland, because soon after that, the drug which has more or less eradicated tuberculosis from Scotland was discovered. And so the patients were obviously getting better. But there were some who were so ill that they weren't responding to the drug, and they, of course, died eventually. And my job was to encourage them to paint. They were in for a long time, to take their mind off the fact they'd lost the freedom in the world, and just to have fun painting. It was less therapeutic in the sense that it is in psychiatry. But as time went on, I was fascinated by the change of mood that crept into their paintings. And I began to see what was happening, that as the tuberculosis increased, and as you probably know with tuberculosis, there is a point where people have a hemoptysis. It's a hemorrhaging of the lung. Usually they recover. Now, I collected the paintings, and as it built up towards this hemoptysis, because nobody knew that was going to happen. They knew it might happen, but they wouldn't know when it was going to happen. I would see the paintings becoming more blood red, more thundery. Skies, just ordinary landscapes were changing. Often crucifixions and things crept in. Immediately after the hemoptysis, obviously if there was a day or two they would be too ill to do anything, then the paintings were rather dull, grey-green landscapes with no punch about them at all. And it went on like that, and then you would see them change, beginning to build up again, and I could almost predict this was going to happen. And sure enough, it would happen. And then with one of the doctors, we went through all the case records and found that, in fact, we were predicting before medically they could predict the date. They knew what would happen, but they couldn't predict it. So it was fascinating on two sides, both artistically and medically. I was just reading a biography about Chopin and got quite fascinating how everybody knows that he had tuberculosis, whose Polonaise in F minor seems to show the increased intensity in his work and this ominous threat of something going on in his mind. That was Chopin's Polonaise in F minor. When I was working as an art therapist in psychiatric hospitals, because I moved from tuberculosis into working in psychiatry. And then I read work by Jean Dubuffet, the French artist, who considered himself to be a surrealist, but always said he wasn't satisfied with surrealism, that there was something more in art that we hadn't discovered. And he spent his whole life looking for this undiscovered art, as it were, and he first focused on children's art. He felt Western art had conditioned us. We were always influenced by what we thought was beautiful and ugly and so on by Western art, and that there must be a purer art. Children's art, beautiful it is, he felt wasn't mature. At that point of time, talking about the 1930s, 1940s, the first sightings of tribal art was being brought into Europe. But the more he discovered about tribal art was that it was extremely ritualistic, and that the shaman who produced these works were in fact dictated to by their own religions as to what they could paint or make, and the patterns had to be repeated. So it wasn't individualistic as one would expect from art. And then some of his friends were doctors, and some of them said, look, we work in in those days, psychiatric asylums. Why don't you come and see what our patients are painting? And Dubuffet went to the big lunatic asylum in Lausanne, and it was there that he discovered what he then called art brut.
The consideration given to the work of professional artists has had the effect of conditioning the public, of creating a state of mind which makes it responsive only to the art displayed in museums or galleries. Any works which depart from the accepted codes are given no more than a passing or condescending glance, or, at best, they are granted the status of a marginal art. Yet, it may be that this is a misguided view. It may even be that art thrives in its healthiest form amongst these ordinary people, and that the over-publicized activity of professionals produces merely a specious form of art. We are apt to have a misleading view of madness, imagining it to mean the loss of all discernment and all sense of responsibility. On the contrary, these works took shape in all lucidity. Anyone who has practiced art or even dabbled in it knows what steady and watchful purposefulness is required to see a work through in the same key and to fit every detail into that key. Jean Dubuffet.
Ordinary people, as he called them, who produced this art brut, which I've now called art extraordinary. All of them being very compulsive artists. They cannot stop working. They are all untutored, as was Van Gogh. Van Gogh just felt he had to produce this work, and sometimes it was quite visionary, that it wasn't just landscape, and even his landscapes, which were right in front of him, often became visionary. Not unlike the tuberculous patients, you can see this intensity, something greater than just the landscape he was looking at, unworldly really.
Starry, starry night, flaming flowers that brightly blaze, swirling clouds in violet haze, reflect in Vincent's eyes of china blue, colors changing hue, morning fields of amber grain, weathered faces lined in pain are soothed beneath the artist's loving hand. Now I understand what you tried to say to me, and how you suffered for your sanity.
That was a piece by Don McLean called Vincent. William Blake was a visionary artist. He produced work in his period which was quite different from all the artists working around him, although he was very knowledgeable and he was trained in many ways. He was an extremely religious man, and practically all his work was on the theme of the Bible or the sort of Pilgrim's Progress type of work. Amazing work. Many of the art brut artists or art extraordinary artists have had mental illness. Now that is not something anybody can decide to become schizophrenic or psychotic. It's something that overcomes the person. whereas Blake insisted that he could turn it on and turn it off at will.
How sweet is the shepherd's sweet lot, from the morn to the evening he strays. He shall follow his sheep all the day, and his tongue shall be filled with praise. For he hears the lamb's innocent call, and he hears the ew's tender reply. He is watchful while they are in peace, for they know when the shepherd is nigh.
A setting of Vaughan Williams from Blake's poem, The Shepherd. I recently went to a hospital near here because there was a girl with a big folio of paintings, but in fact it was very ordinary. It is very rare. In the 30 years I've been collecting this work, I've only come across about 15 artists. So that is extremely rare because I have access to every hospital in Scotland with psychiatric patients. I got a lot of medical students used to come in and try to produce schizophrenic pictures to confuse me, but you could tell them a mile off, you cannot do this. They try too hard pictures, whereas the schizophrenics just let it flow. So the surrealist artists were feeling if we could get into our unconscious, we would get such exciting visions that they were actually taking hallucinogenic drugs. But people playing on drugs never quite produce that. It gets confused and muddly and it isn't what they are seeing somehow. But that is what the surrealism was trying to do and trying to use the symbolism that meant to them so much. Everybody uses symbolism in logos and things, but no, we don't see when we're looking at something quite ordinary, like a chair or a table. But I can actually show you a painting by a schizophrenic, which is a chair, but it's also a person. And they can almost double see on occasions. An album recently produced by a musician who I call a musician extraordinary. He calls himself Lone Pigeon, although his name is Gordon. He was a student, he was going to art college and took ill when he was at art college, was hospitalised, and I met him when he was in hospital. He's now extremely well and back dividing his time between painting and writing music non-stop. Again, you get this compulsion, this intensity to get over all that seems to be inside them. When you get to know more about these people, they're always using symbolism to try to get over the visionary meaning in their work.
So behind you are meant to be lots of harmonies kind of going.
We're in West Newhall Cottage, seeing Gordon, who's one of the artists extraordinary.
Hello, my name is Gordon Anderson, and I record under Lone Pigeon.
Going to play Concubine Rice. The lyrics have always fascinated me because it sounds like a nice little ditty about going to the zoo. No. But tell us about Concubine Rice.
The word concubine is like a mistress, isn't it? And at that time I had been very ill, mentally ill for about 7 years. I spent a lot of time not with girls, I suppose. And in that period of my life I just felt that, have some concubine rice, have a bit, rice is obviously a plate full of lots of girls. It's an imagery of hell, basically.
Your first line is, she went to the house...
She walks down to the elephant sanctuary tonight.
Keep going.
She walks down to the elephant sanctuary. The elephant sanctuary was Israel. She is in Eve. To write a letter for the chimpanzee by the candlelight. The chimpanzee by the candlelight is man at the moment, way back. But she's before then, writing a letter.
Prophesying.
Yeah, prophesying the sin that man went through because of her kind of slight mistake.
She walks down to the elephant sanctuary tonight and writes a letter for the chimpanzee by the candlelight. Orangutan swings in the morning as the sun puts up a light, and lying and snoring on a pillow of leaves. She opens up the cage and lets the pelicans fly about. She notices when toucan and parrot arrive. Breakfast in the morning on an old brown copper plate. We're having lizards and concubine rides.
The people in the hospital have a very strange sense of poetry they don't hear. Like even when I was in there, I was like, wow, that's strange. Or like drawings that you just don't seem like, they seem effortless, but without any real knowledge of what they're doing. They just seem to, but even more than a child would, child drawings all look the same, but these are like different kinds of children. It's like an odd child. Last night I was up until about 5:30, because I had 4 songs going at one time.
How do you mean 4 songs? Do I understand that going at one time? Songs that you've written, or?
Yeah, songs that I'd just written that night, and I was in the middle of working on a fast one. And I was in the middle of working this heartbreaking one called Love. I can write 5 songs in 5 minutes, if you know what I mean, because sometimes they just come out. And I could show you what I have, music-wise. I've got about 1,200 songs on here.
Why did you have the pressure last night?
Well, the love of the labour of the toil. And then I was working on well, it's just here, it just goes like this. Well, they're just scribbled down.
I love it. Lyrics on the back of Van Gogh.
It might be too loud, but the song was basically, maybe I'll look. Maybe I'll lose my ocean air. Maybe I'll live to smile again. Maybe these times will change and I'll feel good. I'll feel so right sitting next to you. So that was fun.
Tell me, if you had ever been in a position where you had never heard an orchestra or
music,
pianist or anything, this music would still be in your head, wouldn't it?
I'm not sure. It'd be good. It'd be good not ever, I've always, one of my main aims is to try and create an album that, aliens might have created. Probably all be out of time, you think we're, our time's in time, but it's probably not. You can get 1,000,000 miles away from the earth, kind of feeling.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking of a Beethoven piece where it is as mentally ill as you get, but it's just well organised. It's a Moonlight Sonata, but not the first part, the third part. Meant to be a horse going through the fields. Ding, 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 ding.
And why do you think that at that point he's more disturbed or more?
Well, there's notes like going, I can't play it, but there's notes kind of, I should just let you hear it. There's notes that are just going ding, 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 ding. This is a nice bit. But you can imagine the horse, it's a horse. I feel that's what he was trying to convey. But the bit later, this is kind of back to seeing the moonlight again. And then he's getting, hold on. You know what I mean? And I think that's jumping the fences. Or Or it's a chase, maybe. I think he's maybe chasing a woman. But there's a mad bit near the end, it just gets really quiet. I think the girl on the horse got away. There's a tragedy in it as well, but there's a bit where it's just, gosh, this is mental. Just so beautiful, but it's just so crushing.
One of the better known artists in the Art Extraordinary collection is called Angus McPhee, son of a crofter. He was an intelligent man who bred ponies and looked after all the animals on the croft. And we even knew that he sometimes at Cayley's would sing. Angus took ill. He became quite ill when he was in the Faroes during the war, a psychotic illness. And when the psychiatrist came in to see him, he ambulanced him away to the hospital, which was in Inverness, Craigdenane. And there was Angus for 50 years. In those days, they kept them all that time. And the others would go in and slump into their chairs, watching television or something, whereas Angus would go out and pull grass from the fields round about and start to make clothing by weaving the grass, and the clothing he hid under the bushes. He even made tailcoats out of grass, and hats and gloves and all sorts of things. When he arrived in hospital, he wouldn't speak, and for 50 years he was never known to speak a single word. This is an extract from the Scottish fairy tale called Rashan Coty, which is like one of the Cinderella stories. The girl that in this story was cast out by her mother and father in favour of an older sister.
Once, a long time ago, there was a gentleman had 2 lassies. The oldest was ugly and ill-natured, but the youngest was a bonny lassie and good. But the ugly one was the favourite with her father and mother. So they ill-used the youngest in every way, and they sent her into the woods to herd cattle, and all the food she got was a little porridge and whey. Well, amongst the cattle was a red calf, and one day it said to the lassie, "Gie that porridge and whey to the doggie, and come wi' me." She got on the calf's back, and they ran away. And they ran, and better nor ran, till they came to a meadow where grew a great lot of rashes. And as the lassie had not on many clothes, they pulled rashes, and made a coatie for her. And they set off again and travelled, till they came to the king's house. So she went to the kirk, and nobody kent it was Rashan Coty. They wondered who the bonny lady could be. He kent her at once, she was so bonny, and when she tried on the shoe it fitted her. And so the prince married Rashan Coty, and they lived happy and built a house for the red calf who had been so kind to her.
That was an extract from a traditional fairy story called Rashan Coty. It was in the 1990s. The 1990s, psychiatric hospitals started closing. Angus was now quite able to look after himself, although he still never spoke. In the 50 years, he had never spoken to anyone in the hospital. And they found a place for him in Uist, where he came from. They flew him home, and he lived in the old people's home. When he went back to Uist, I didn't expect him to speak, because I had known him for about 20 years, and I'd never heard him speak. And I took with me different wools so that he could feel, because he was going blind. And I thought it'd be something for him to feel. And the colleague that was with me knew a bit about horses, and he said, "Angus, we've just seen a little photograph of you on horseback that your sister's given to us." And Angus suddenly looked up and in perfect English said, "Aye, that was a fine gelding." And I thought, I can go back now to meet him several times and find out more about why he made all these clothes. Sadly, the next thing I heard, he had died. So that we'll never know why he made all these things he made. I can't think of anything else that can be purer than Angus MacPhee's art. Whether he thought of it as art wouldn't really matter. When I was sort of researching this in, I think it was the 1990s, a man 5,000 years old was discovered in the Alps, known as the Iceman. But the fascinating thing to me was, in the photographs that came out, was that there was lengths of rope which you could not detect the difference between the rope by this Iceman and the rope that Angus MacPhee made. So it was almost as if Angus MacPhee somehow in his mind could drift back into prehistoric times, or 5,000 years old. At the same time, Angus MacPhee was linking beech leaves in the same way as the contemporary artist Andy Goldsworthy was linking them. So it's as if time doesn't have the same meaning for these people as it does for us. They seem to have access to going back in time and almost forward in time. I don't belong to a church. I'm interested in all the different faiths. Standing stones, I'm fascinated by the Pictish carvings, which to me are all religion. There is another thing about Angus MacPhee's work. He made little pouches that I call like cornucopia pouches, and he hung those on trees. He didn't hide those under the bushes. Now, was that some sort of offering? Some reason to link to a higher deity? And that maybe there was magic about putting them under holly bushes. But there's so much folklore about holly bushes. But that's where he chose to hide them. There's one Swiss psychiatrist has described the work of patients through their art as being like a garden, and that they are creating a garden with all these beautiful things that they see and understand. We can never enter that garden, but we can look at it through their paintings. It's like looking through a keyhole. Prior to art coming into hospitals, that was just unknown. And so I think we've got a much more tolerant understanding of people who have illness now.
Something Understood was presented this week by Joyce Lang. She was speaking with Gordon Anderson, who records under the name Lone Pigeon. The readers were Alain Fontaine and Sheena Anthony. The programme was produced by Matt Thompson.